The hours stretched on. Like a slow, grinding machine. Every tick of the station clock. Another reminder of just how small they were trying to make him feel. Ethan sat alone. On the cold metal bench. Inside the holding cell. His cuffed hands resting in his lap. Wrists sore and raw. Where the steel had dug into his skin. He kept his back straight. His chin lifted. Even though every part of him ached. To just sink down. To rest. To give in. To the exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. But he wouldn't. Not now. Not here. The sting of the injustice. Burned hotter than the physical pain. The way Mallory had laughed under his breath. While filling out bogus charges. The way Benson had looked away. Every time their eyes met. Pretending he didn't see what was happening. Pretending he didn't know. Ethan knew. He knew exactly what was happening. And deep down. So did Benson. That flicker of hesitation. That nervous energy. Benson knew they were wrong. He just didn't have the spine to stop it. The faint buzz of the station's fluorescent lights filled the empty air, mixing with the occasional distant shout from another cell block. The heavy footsteps of officers walking the halls. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. And rang. Unanswered. Ethan stared at the peeling gray wall across from him. Focusing on his breathing. In. Out. In. Out. Steady. Controlled. If they thought they could break him with humiliation. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. He closed his eyes for a moment. Letting the rhythm of his breath drown out the rest of it. The smell of mildew and sweat. The sting of the cuffs. The echo of Mallory's sneering voice. They didn't know. They didn't know the kind of storm they were waking up. Time passed in a strange, elastic way, inside the cell. Minutes dragging like hours. Ethan tried not to think about the press conference. He was supposed to be preparing for. About the speech he had meticulously written. The leadership team, waiting for his final revisions. He wondered if Clara, his assistant, had realized something was wrong yet. She would. She always did. And when she found out. A slow, grim smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. They wouldn't be able to bury this. Not once she got involved. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Snapping him back to the present. Keys rattled. The cell door creaked open. Mallory stood there, arms crossed. A smug smirk plastered across his face. On your feet, he barked. Ethan rose slowly. Refusing to hurry. Refusing to show an ounce of fear. The cuffs stayed tight. Biting into his skin with every movement. Benson stood a few feet behind Mallory. Looking everywhere, except at Ethan. Time to make it official, Mallory said. With a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. Welcome to the system, Brooks. They led him down a dim hallway. Toward a small, windowless room. With a battered metal desk bolted to the floor. The walls yellowed from age. The ceiling tiles stained with watermarks. An ancient computer flickered on the desk. Its screen displaying a generic intake form. Sit, Mallory ordered. Shoving Ethan down into the rickety chair. The officer behind the desk didn't even look up. Confirm your name for the record. Ethan Brooks, Ethan said. His voice clear and strong. The officer typed it in, with 2 fingers. Painfully slow. Charges pending, Mallory recited. Loitering, resisting arrest, failure to comply. Ethan's jaw tightened. Those are false. Mallory leaned down. bringing his face level with Ethan's. His breath hot and sour. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice low. "All that matters, is what's in the report." The man behind the desk gave a tired shrug. Like it wasn't his business. Like none of it mattered. Just another cog in the machine. Ethan stared straight ahead, refusing to react. They finished processing him without further comment. Snapping a grainy intake photo. With a clunky old camera mounted in the corner. The flash was blinding for half a second. Then gone. Leaving Ethan blinking away spots. As they marched him back toward the holding cells. The hallway darker now. The station quieter. The late shift lull. Ethan was shoved back into a different cell. Smaller. More isolated. No windows. No view of anything. Except 4 cracked walls. And a drain in the center of the floor. Mullery slammed the door behind him. The lock clicking shut, with grim finality. "You'll get your hearing tomorrow," he said through the bars. Grinning. Maybe. And then he was gone. The silence was thicker here. Heavier. Ethan sat back down on the narrow bench. His mind racing now. Not with fear. But with calculation. Tomorrow. Was supposed to be the day everything changed. The press conference. The announcement. His new role, made public. He wondered if anyone at City Hall even knew he was missing yet. They would. Sooner or later, someone would notice. And when they did, this wouldn't be just a personnel mistake. It would be a public scandal. A reckoning. For now, though, he was trapped. A black man in a holding cell. Accused of imaginary crimes. Just for existing. In the wrong place. At the wrong time. Or at least. That's what Mullery thought. That's what Benson pretended to believe. Ethan flexed his wrists against the cuffs. Testing the tightness. The pain was sharp. Immediate. But he welcomed it. It reminded him he was still here. Still fighting. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fold. He was going to wait. And then. He was going to make them regret. Ever thinking. They could treat him like just another statistic. He leaned back against the wall. Letting the cold seep into his bones. Grounding him. They thought this was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was just the beginning. The hours inside the holding cell. Blurred together. Stretching longer. Heavier. With every passing minute. The walls seemed to close in tighter. The air. Turning thick with the smell of old concrete. And forgotten anger. Ethan sat there in the stillness. Feeling the weight of the system. Pressing down on him. Trying to squeeze the fight. Out of his spirit. But he wasn't built to break. Somewhere outside the cell. Voices echoed through the halls. Distorted by the metal. And the stone. Occasionally. Heavy boots would stomp past. Indifferent. Uninterested. To them. He was just another black man in a suit. Who must have done something wrong. Why else would he be sitting there? Cuffed. Stripped of his dignity. Locked away like a criminal. The thought burned low and deep in his chest. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. Who had ever sat where he was sitting now. Innocent. But presumed guilty. Judged before being heard. Condemned. Before being seen. Footsteps approached again. Louder this time. Stopping just outside his door. The latch clanged. The metal hinges groaning. As it swung open. Mullery stood there. Arms folded. A smirk carved into his weathered face. "Let's go, Brooks," he said. Like he was talking to a stray dog. "Time for some quality bonding time." Ethan stood slowly. Every movement controlled. Deliberate. He stepped out of the cell without a word. Refusing to give Mallory the satisfaction of seeing anything but calm in his eyes. Benson was waiting a few feet down the hallway. Hands shoved into his pockets. His expression unreadable. Ethan caught the slight downward glance. The way Benson refused to meet his eyes. Good. He should be ashamed. Mallory led the way. Pushing open a door at the end of the hallway. It swung inward. Revealing a small, grimy interrogation room. Bare walls. A battered table. 2 mismatched chairs. 1 flickering fluorescent light above. Humming like a dying insect. "Sit," Mallory barked. Ethan took his seat. Cuffs still digging into his wrists. Leaving angry red marks across his skin. Mallory circled him, like a wolf. Sizing up prey. Benson hung back near the door. Silent. Uneasy. "You know," Mallory said. Dropping into the chair opposite Ethan. "You could make this real easy." Ethan lifted an eyebrow slightly. Saying nothing. "Tell us what you were really doing out there tonight," Mallory continued. "Tell us what you're hiding." "There's nothing to tell," Ethan said. Voice steady. "I was walking home from work." "That's it." Mallory leaned back. Chuckling darkly. "See, that's the thing. Men like you. You never just walk home. You're always up to something." Ethan's hands curled into fists. Where they rested on the table. The metal cuffs rattling softly. He forced himself to breathe. To stay composed. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. Mallory's grin widened. "Don't have to. I know the type." Benson shifted uncomfortably near the door. Ethan caught it. The way his jaw tightened. The way his shoulders hunched. Like he was trying to disappear. Good. Let it make him uncomfortable. Let it eat at him. Mallory slapped a manila folder down on the table. With a loud thwack. Papers spilled out. Random printouts. Old booking reports. Nothing related to Ethan. "We're building a case," Mallory said. "Plenty of priors fitting your description. Wouldn't be hard to connect a few dots. Maybe we find your prints on something. Maybe a witness remembers seeing you." Ethan stared at him. The disbelief. Threatening to boil over. They weren't even pretending to follow the law. They were just making it up as they went. Confident no one would question them. Confident the system would cover for them. Like it always had. "You're bluffing," Ethan said finally. His voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. "And you know it." Mallory's smile faltered. Just for a second. A crack in the armor. Ethan pressed the advantage. Leaning forward slightly. "You have nothing," he said. "Because I've done nothing. And every minute you keep me here without cause. You're digging your own grave." Mallory's eyes narrowed dangerously. Across the room. Benson looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Mallory shoved back from the table. The chair screeching against the floor. He stood there for a moment. Fists clenched. Breathing hard through his nose. "You think you're better than us," he snarled. "You think wearing a fancy suit and carrying a briefcase makes you untouchable." "No," Ethan said calmly. "I think following the law makes me untouchable." The room crackled with tension. Heavy enough to suffocate. Mallory loomed over him. His shadow stretching across the table. For a long moment. Ethan thought he might lash out. Hit him. drag him down to the floor, and justify it later with some bogus story about resisting. But then Mallory straightened, yanked the door open, and barked at Benson. "Get him out of my sight." Benson hesitated. Only a second. But enough to notice. Before stepping forward and gripping Ethan's arm, leading him back out into the hallway. They didn't speak as they walked. The only sounds were the distant buzz of the lights, and the shuffle of their shoes on the scuffed tile. Back in the cell, Benson paused before locking the door. For the first time that night, he looked Ethan in the eye. Really looked. There was a flicker there. Guilt. Shame. Maybe even doubt. Good. Because soon, Benson would have to answer for his silence. Just like Mallory would have to answer for his actions. The door clanged shut, locking Ethan inside once again. He sat back down on the bench. Cuffs still tight. The ache in his wrists pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow, steady breath. They thought they could bury him. They thought they could humiliate him into silence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And they were about to find out. The news spread like oil through water. Officer Dean Carroll read the email twice. Blinked. Then slammed his locker shut harder than necessary. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "That guy baited us. He set this up." Miranda Blake sat on a bench nearby, pale and tight-jawed. She hadn't spoken much since the release. Her name was all over the preliminary reports. Her voice was on the body cam audio. The restraint in her tone. The command in her posture. It all painted a picture she couldn't erase. But it was the footage of Elijah that unsettled her the most. The way he didn't resist. The way he didn't flinch. As if he had already seen every version of this play. Knew the ending. And simply waited for it to collapse under its own weight. For Miranda, the silence had become unbearable. In the break room. In the locker room. Even at home. Where the phone had stopped ringing. And her sister hadn't replied to texts in 2 days. Shame had a smell, she realized. It clung to her like smoke. Thick. Sour. And impossible to wash out. By noon, 2 internal affairs agents arrived at the precinct. Wearing crisp suits and hollow expressions. They weren't there to explain. They were there to observe. To document. To tear through every file. That might tell them if what happened to Elijah Merrick was a one-time error. Or a pattern. And deep down, most of the staff already knew the answer. That afternoon, a community meeting was called across town. At a modest church in Treem. The pews filled with residents. Pastors. Teachers. And youth leaders. Faces worn from too many vigils. Too many names etched into murals. A banner read, "We believe in accountability." Elijah didn't take the microphone until nearly the end. He hadn't come to preach. He came to listen. To take the pulse of a community that had watched him rise. From a local kid with nothing. To a federal officer with influence. And then watched him get slammed against a wall. Like he was still 12 years old. And out of place. When he finally stood. The room hushed. Not with fear. But reverence. "I'm not here today because I'm important." Elijah began. His voice low and clear. "I'm here because I'm not supposed to be. Because somewhere along the way, someone decided that no matter how many badges I earned, how many departments I served, my skin color still overruled my credentials." He paused, letting the word sit heavy in the air. I wasn't profiled as a threat because I did anything wrong. I was profiled because I existed in the wrong place. Wearing the wrong skin. Walking too confidently in a neighborhood where I wasn't expected to belong. There were nods. Quiet tears. A child nestled against his mother's shoulder whispered, "Mama, is he okay now?" Elijah continued. But here's what they didn't count on. I'm not alone. I never was. Every injustice has a tipping point. And every mistake, especially the ones made in uniform, has a cost. It's time they pay it. The room broke into applause. Not rowdy, but resilient. It wasn't the kind of cheer that fades after a headline. It was the sound of resolve. Back at the precinct, chaos simmered beneath the surface. Several officers called in sick. Others deleted years' worth of texts and emails, hoping to cover their tracks before the next wave of scrutiny arrived. But the truth had already started to unravel. Complaints that had been dismissed. Patterns that had been ignored. Names that had been quietly moved around, rather than disciplined. The thin blue line wasn't just fraying. It was splitting open. Prescott stood in his office, watching the walls close in, and realized too late. Silence had never been protection. It was a confession. And Elijah Merrick. He wasn't finished. The hallways of the New Orleans 7th Precinct were quieter than they had ever been. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that follows resolution or rest, but the suffocating silence that settles over a place after impact. When no one knows what to say, and everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. Officers moved like ghosts through corridors they no longer trusted. The break room had become a war zone of side eyes and sudden exits. Loyalty had turned into suspicion. And the badge no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a target. The storm had arrived. And no one could outrun it. The first to fall was Officer Dean Carroll. A federal auditor discovered a pattern of fabricated stop reports. Years of traffic stops in black neighborhoods, with no citations filed, no reports written, and no body cam footage ever logged. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Carroll was placed on unpaid leave pending investigation. But the department knew what that meant. He was done. His locker, once cluttered with photos of his kids and old football trophies, was cleaned out before sundown. More followed. Internal Affairs began holding closed-door sessions. In the old interrogation room. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very room where suspects were once grilled was now where officers were sweating under the heat of their own policies. Names once whispered behind closed doors now echoed across open complaints. Miranda Blake, Lieutenant Marcus Wren, Sergeant Lel Deeks. The old guard. The ones who shaped precinct culture with smirks and slaps on the back, suddenly found themselves drowning in the weight of paper trails. And every time a new officer was pulled in for questioning, Elijah Merrick's name hovered like a ghost in the air. He had become a symbol. Unwanted by some, necessary to others. To the officers who had once dismissed him as overpolished, he was now a reckoning. But to the city outside, the people who had waited too long for someone to speak for them, Elijah had become a voice louder than the sirens, steadier than the law. Outside the precinct walls, things had shifted. A group of local business owners in the French Quarter released a joint statement demanding transparency and reforms. Clergy from different faiths began hosting roundtable discussions with community activists and local leaders. High school students marched from Congo Square to the courthouse, chanting Elijah's name. Alongside calls for justice. And on the steps of City Hall, a mural had begun to form. Vibrant. Defiant. Painted by artists from across the state. At the center was Elijah's face. Above it. He walked. They stopped. We rose. Within the precinct. Pressure turned to collapse. Captain Jerome Prescott tried to maintain control. But his hands were tied tighter every day. City Council had mandated third-party oversight. His officers refused to speak to the press. And the public relations officer resigned without warning. Even the union, once so ready to protect its own, had gone silent. No statements. No support. Only legal disclaimers and procedural footnotes. Prescott stared at his calendar, noting how every scheduled staff meeting was now accompanied by an exit interview. One afternoon, he called Miranda Blake into his office. She hadn't said much in days. But her silence said everything. When she entered, her face was composed. But her eyes betrayed her. "I need to know where you stand," Prescott said quietly. Miranda didn't blink. "I stand where I should have stood 3 years ago." He exhaled slowly. Nodded. "Then you know what's coming." She did. Her resignation letter was already folded in her back pocket. But not everyone left quietly. Late that evening, as the sun draped the bayou in deep orange, Officer Thomas Griggs stormed into the locker room and punched through the glass of a vending machine. He was tired of being painted a villain, he said. Tired of being lumped in with bad actors. Just because he wore the same badge. But when his voice rose, the room didn't nod in sympathy. No one clapped him on the back. No one backed him up. Instead, one rookie, fresh out of the academy, wide-eyed and painfully sincere, asked a question that cut deeper than anything else had. "Then why didn't you ever speak up?" Griggs stared at the kid, mouth open. Words caught somewhere between his lungs and his ego. He didn't answer. Because there was no good answer. And the moment passed. Like a final breath before collapse. In that silence, a new kind of honesty took root. Some officers began meeting in off hours. Not to defend themselves, but to unlearn. A volunteer-led workshop on racial bias. Filled faster than anyone expected. Formerly anonymous whistleblowers started attaching their names to old complaints. A group of female officers formed an internal coalition, demanding safer policies for both officers and civilians. Something was breaking. Yes. But maybe for the first time. It was breaking in the right direction. And Elijah Merrick. He didn't bask in the unraveling. He stayed busy. Too busy to gloat. Too committed to let anger lead. He attended hearings. Advised legal teams. Stood beside families whose sons and brothers had been silenced long before him. His face was on television. But he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His truth was doing the shouting for him. Back inside the 7th precinct, one thing had become clear. Uniforms no longer guaranteed loyalty, protection, or silence. The unraveling had come. Not from the outside, but from within. Thread by thread. Officer by officer. Truth by undeniable truth. And what came next would change New Orleans forever. The courtroom was still when Elijah Merrick entered. Not in silence, but in breath. Expectation. Every eye followed him as he walked down the aisle. The rhythm of his footsteps, steady, deliberate, echoing off marble walls. that had heard too many stories of injustice, whispered between their cracks. But this story, his story, was different. It wasn't whispered. It was now spoken in full. Without shame. Without apology. Outside, the city of New Orleans held its breath. Bourbon Street pulsed in the distance. But not with celebration. It was more like the pause between thunderclaps. Electric. And waiting. News vans crowded the courthouse steps. Protesters and supporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Strangers. Once divided by silence. Now united by clarity. The man they had once mistaken as just another name in a file now stood for something larger than any case. But Elijah hadn't come to claim vengeance. He had come to finish the work. As he took his seat at the witness table, the weight of the moment did not bend him. In fact, it steadied him. Across from him sat the officers who had wrongfully detained him. Paige Rollins. Her expression hollow with fear and fading defiance. And Daryl Mackey, whose once arrogant posture had slouched under months of headlines, hearings, and public disgrace. Their defense team sat stone-faced, knowing full well what the tide outside these walls already knew. This was not a trial about procedure. This was a reckoning. About perception. About patterns. About power. When Elijah spoke, the courtroom stilled to listen. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. His voice was even, textured by the weight of lived experience. He spoke about the day on Bourbon Street. Not just the moment he was handcuffed, but the lifetime of moments that led to it. The years of walking into stores and being followed. The job interviews where he was told he was overqualified. The sideways glances. The polite exclusions. The justified fear. But then he spoke about something else. About hope. He talked about the night he was released. And how he sat alone in his apartment. And wrote out names. Not of enemies. Not of officers. But of the kids he'd mentored. The families who'd sent him letters. Since the story broke. The strangers who stopped him on the street. With tears in their eyes saying, "I've been waiting for someone to say what you said." He talked about how he didn't press charges out of anger, but out of necessity. "If I stay silent," he said, "then every young black man who watched that footage learns a dangerous lesson. That even the truth won't protect you. I can't let that be the final word." And then he turned to face the courtroom. Not just the judge. Not just the jury. But everyone. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," he said. "I'm here to build something better. In the ruins of what we thought was justice." His words didn't draw applause. They didn't need to. They settled into the bones of the room. Like something ancient. And holy. The judge. A stern but fair woman. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor. Leaned slightly forward after Elijah finished. There was no gavel strike. No scolding of the gallery. Just silence. Respectful. Earned silence. When the ruling came, it was swift. Both officers were found guilty. Not just of misconduct, but of violating constitutional rights. Paige Rollins was dismissed permanently from service. And barred from rejoining any law enforcement agency in the state. Daryl Mackey faced federal review. For prior complaints that had been swept aside. More investigations would follow. And the precinct would never be the same. But for Elijah, the real victory came afterward. In the weeks that followed, community review boards were approved citywide. Training protocols changed. The mayor issued a public apology. One that actually sounded like it meant something. And Elijah, instead of retreating, began teaching workshops across the state. His sessions weren't just about rights. They were about visibility. About courage. About healing. One night, after speaking to a crowd of nearly 200 officers in Baton Rouge, a young white recruit approached him. Nervous. Fidgeting. "I was taught to see people as threats," the recruit admitted. "But today, I saw you. Not just as a victim, but as someone I want to learn from." Elijah didn't say much. Just nodded. That was enough. Because in the end, truth doesn't need vengeance to stand. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it. And someone human enough to listen. And Elijah Merrick, once mistaken, once handcuffed, once doubted, had become the voice that changed a city. Not by shouting it down, but by making it rise up. Elijah Merrick's story was never just about a wrongful arrest. It was about what happens when one man stands firm in the face of an entire system that tries to reduce him to a stereotype. It started with a routine patrol. A pair of officers making a decision, based not on facts, but on fear wrapped in assumption. A man walking down Bourbon Street, minding his own business, was seen not as a citizen, but as a suspect, simply because of the color of his skin. But what those officers didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was who Elijah Merrick truly was. They saw a hoodie. They saw a man alone. They didn't see the decades of service, the quiet influence, or the countless lives he'd already touched. And in that moment, their ignorance didn't just cost them a mistake. It sparked a reckoning. What unfolded next wasn't a courtroom drama, but a movement. A city forced to confront its own reflection. A police department stripped bare of its protections, and forced to ask hard questions. And at the center of it all, Elijah didn't choose revenge. He chose responsibility. He could have let the headlines fade. He could have cashed out and moved on. But instead he spoke. He led. He built. And because of that choice, his story became more than an isolated injustice. It became a blueprint for justice in motion. The lesson here isn't just about race or law enforcement. It's about accountability, humanity, and the silent power of integrity. Elijah didn't just change the conversation in New Orleans. He reminded us that silence is a luxury. That justice can no longer afford. That when we look the other way, we don't stay neutral. We become complicit. In a world where judgment is often instant, and change feels painfully slow, Elijah's story urges us to pause. To think. To challenge our instincts. Because behind every description, behind every assumption, is a human being. With a story we don't yet know. And maybe the most radical thing we can do in today's world is listen. So what can you take from this story? That real change begins with uncomfortable truths. That leadership doesn't require a title. It requires courage. That every step you take toward justice, even if it's small, matters. Speak up when something feels wrong. Ask questions when silence is easier. And most of all, see people, not profiles. If this story moved you, if Elijah's strength inspired you or made you see things differently, we invite you to join us in this conversation. Share this message. Talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every like, every comment, every subscription gives us the strength and support to keep creating powerful, real stories. That challenge, inspire. And push us all toward a better world. Because this is not the end. It's the beginning of something greater. And we need you with us.